Shabbat Shalom for those of you who are joining us on YouTube. I am excited to once again get with you guys and do some discussions, some teachings, and some learnings. I wanted to talk a minute about the structure of After His Heart Ministries. What was the vision behind it? What was the heart behind it? Well, the heart behind it originally was based upon a rejection that had occurred, where basically a ministry had turned away a number of people who were valuable to our family. And we, as a family, concluded that that was an injustice, and we decided to do something about it. Well, of course, my mom actually was the one who said, I want to start a ministry where people are not turned away. Well, it's interesting because that eventually turned into what we have today, which is consequently that we are reaching people who may or may not be able to actually go to a church, or may not be able to actually go and be localized in their relationship with their various spiritual interactions with people. I had to turn up the brightness on the lights a little bit, so now my glasses are showing all their blurs. You know, it's interesting when we work with the model that we work with, we have had to really open our minds. How do you navigate the fundamental Christian doctrine and still reach the world without creating some sort of bias? And what I mean by that is as a bias of saying, here's the unsaved people and here's the saved people, and we are going to treat the saved people a certain way. In fact, people will actually say, oh, you know what? He's a Christian. He knows Christ. Come sit with us, eat at this table. But then they will look at a person who has an addiction, or a person who has committed a crime, or a person who is down and who is cast down from society, and they're not welcome at the table because they supposedly don't know Christ. So this ministry has been very, very instrumental in trying to embrace the all, right? Why? Why would I embrace the all when there are clear boundaries drawn by the guide of the nation of Israel in the wilderness, which would be Yahweh, right? Why? When he says, this nation is this way, I'm going to make a distinction between this nation, and that distinction is going to result in a catastrophic destruction of this nation and a tolerance of this nation. What do I say tolerance? He said, when he was sending the nation of Israel into the promised land, I'm not sending you in because you are good. I am sending you in because you're not as bad as the ones that are in there. Whoa, what an insult, all right? And then in another place it says, he did not choose you because you were a great nation, because they were a great nation. In fact, upwards of, 1.2 million people walked out of Egypt, women and children and men. Who knows how much livestock, but let's just assume that the livestock was abundant enough that there were maybe 7 to 8 cows per household, so to speak. I mean, not every household, of course. So this is huge thing coming out of Egypt, and he says, I didn't choose you because you were great. I didn't choose you because you had numbers. I chose you because I promised Abraham I would choose you. But then he takes it a step further and says, I chose you because I love you. And that was powerful. Okay. So then they go into this wilderness, right? And there's a number of people. Now, I want you to think about this number of people, because generally speaking, the best way we could put it is in Psalm 95, I believe it is. In fact, let me go ahead and read it for you really quick. I think more than anything else, what we're trying to see here is what actually was the reason for the deliverance from Egypt. And can we identify that there's actually a bias to Yahweh's operation in such a way to say that he chose certain people and didn't choose certain people the way, say, the Christian fundamentalists from the Calvinist side believe, right? Total depravity, unlimited or unconditional election, right? Limited atonement, irresistible grace and perseverance saints. Literally, I pick them, I save them, I use them, and nobody else gets that privilege. Instead, to show that it is definitely about choice. But the way that I want to do that is I want to look at Psalm 95 and talk a minute about what it is saying here, because it's quoted in Hebrews, right? And so specifically we are looking for, and in Psalm 95 is short enough, we can just read the whole thing. We'll go ahead and switch over to that screen. And let's do NLT on this one. NLT. Come, let us sing to Yahweh. Let us shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. Let us come to him with thanksgiving. Let us sing psalms of praise to him. For Yahweh is a great Elohim, a great king or Melech above all Elohim. He holds in his hands the depths of the earth and the mightiest mountains. The sea belongs to him, for he made it. His hands form the dry ground too. Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before Yahweh our Maker, for he is our Elohim. We are the people he watches over, the flock under his care. If only you would listen to his voice today. Yahweh says, do not harden your hearts as Israel did at Meribah, right? As they did at Massa in the wilderness. For your ancestors tested and tried my patience, even though they saw everything I did. For 40 years I was angry with them, and I said, they are a people whose hearts turn away from me. They refuse to do what I tell them. So in my anger, I took an oath. They will never enter my place of rest. Woo! Good old Moses, right? Okay, so let's talk a minute about Psalm 95. Psalm 95 seems to indicate that the people who did not go into the promised land were actually the people who rebelled at Meribah and Massa. Now, we're going to get back to Meribah and Massa for a minute, or in a minute. But what I want you to think about is where did the actual rejection and curse occur? The actual rejection and curse occurred at the border of the promised land where the people refused to go in. And they refused to go in. And so Moses says, hey, since you're not going in, you're not going in. And they turned away from the promised land and started to walk back into the wilderness. This is important. This is very important. This is post Golden Calf. This is post wilderness season. This is most likely more in the realm of the fall feasts. But what's important here to know is that that's not when Yahweh made the decision, and so we need to come to some serious conclusions that are actually going to be pretty mind-blowing today. Okay? Now, why would I bring this up? Because we are in the wilderness season, which is when Meribah and Massa occurred. Now, if you think this is actually going to be a sermon about the wilderness season, you're mistaken. This is actually about something even more powerful than the wilderness season. I've preached plenty about how difficult this time becomes because of hungers, thirsts, and fears. Okay? And we're going to get into hunger, thirst, and fears in their own right, but not how you think. And remember, I titled this in your own light. Okay? All right. So now the reason why this is important is because when After His Heart Ministries became a ministry who turns no one away, which means I have to tolerate the attitudes, I have to put up with the idiosyncrasies. And I can tell you, those who step away don't step away because I made them feel unwelcome. And if they have, then I will answer for that to Yahweh, but not definitely of my own intention. I have tried to maintain the people who have come to this ministry because that was my heart, that no one be turned away. And that was actually my mother's heart. But that means that I needed to examine human potential. And what I mean by that is that I can't sit there and placate somebody who violates Torah. I can't have somebody come into my camp munching on a pulled pork sandwich and console them in their behavior. I can't. But what I can do is let them know their true identity. You see, because one of the things that happened that is very, very important concerning all this is that the light of Passover actually gave an opportunity to all who were in Egypt to put blood on their doorpost, and gave an opportunity to all to reject that instruction and die. Not only was it Egyptians, it was Israelites and Egyptians alike who were given the instruction. How do we know? Because it says right in there that there were those who did not put blood on their doorposts. Well, okay, let me take it back. There was a warning that said, if you do not, he's speaking to Hebrews, if you do not, then you will have the same fate as the Egyptians. Well, a just God will then offer the opportunity to what? Repent from your idolatries, turn to the living God, and become a covenanted partner as you were, or maybe that's not the best word because our good old faith movement Pentecostal friends like to use that to explain people who give them an exorbitant amount of money every month. To become covenanted with Yahweh and to connect with Him and to abandon their idolatries, which was always, let me tell you this, idolatry. You guys want to call your cell phone an idol? Fine, you go right ahead. I cannot tell you how to label the things that are destructive in your life, but I can tell you what idolatry truly was. Idolatry was a false identification of a power that could cause something to occur in some way. For example, false identification of a power that could cause the crops to grow, right? And then believing that if there is not a shedding of blood, that is not going to happen. Now, this is very important because Christianity even propagates the notion that Yahweh was an insatiable blood god. But the truth be told is that if you go back and look, sacrifice was never about the destruction of the entire material of the animal, but instead the destruction of the parts that are inedible and that are dangerous to eat, and a consumption, an eating of the actual animal. Now, there were some exceptions to that, and we're not going to get into those today. But I can tell you that generally speaking, there was a consumption of the animal. It was never about the shedding of blood. It even says that in Hebrews, the shedding of blood in bulls and goats never offered a remission of sins. Why can't people get that into their head? Why can't people arrive at the conclusion that it was never about that, it was never supposed to be that, and that is not the instruction that was actually given? Now, the reason this is important is because all of a sudden we need to embrace the fact that a mixed multitude went out of Egypt with the Israelites, what we call the Erev Rav. This Erev Rav has some sort of connection to Israel, And according to the rabbis, the Erev Rav are the ones who rose up the golden calf. I won't deny that, or will I confirm it? But I will tell you that the hearts of the people hardened a long time before we got to the golden calf. And I can tell you that that is why they did not go into Israel or into the promised land. Look again. Don't harden your hearts as Israel did at Meribah, as they did at Massa in the wilderness. The wilderness season, Bamidbar, right? Bamidbar. Let's take a look here. Let's go into this verse. So what do we have? We have not, right? Not. Who? Second person, you. Not you will what? Harden. Not you will harden. So the sentence actually says, you will harden your hearts. And actually it says, you all will harden your all hearts, right? Like, see that cough right there? Like Meribah, right? In the day of Massa, right? Bamidbar, in the wilderness, right? In the wilderness, Bamidbar, which consequently, the way that you need to think about this is that they actually made the choice not to enter the promised land. Where is that located? In the book of Numbers, which in the Hebrew is Bamidbar. Okay, Bamidbar. So what we need to do then is we need to examine Meribah and we need to examine Massa. So let's start with Meribah. It literally means strife or contention, right? It means to quarrel or to provoke, right? From the root word riv, which means to strive or contend, okay? So Meribah means what? It means to quarrel or strife. Now, let's just stop for a minute and let's get our heads straight here, okay? Heads straight. If we were to travel to the sun in a manner in which we would not be burned up, and as exists right now, to the best of my knowledge, we do not have a material that would not be burned up. We have materials that can resist close proximity to it, but actually way further out from Mercury. You start getting into the Mercury area and everything gets incinerated. So Mercury has some pretty special properties, right? But now we get actually very, very close, heliocentric. And at that moment, we stand before the sun and say, I defy you. What is actually going to be accomplished there? Now I want you to think about that the sun actually has a consciousness, and the sun offers consequences for such behavior. Now all of a sudden we get into the realm of the sun just going and we just incinerate, right? Okay. So the word quarrel or provocation here seems to be kind of an understatement, right? These people actually made statements of accusation to something more powerful than the sun, because according to Psalm 33, the sun was breathed, quote unquote, out of his mouth. That's right. We're dealing with a star breather who we're going to now come quarrel with, right? Yeah, no. Okay, so now getting into the other word, we have Massa, which is nasa, to despair or test. Used 5 times, by the way. And in that 5 times is either temptation or trial, and is a testing of men, which is judicial, or of God, which is querulous, right? So this is about tempting, right? Now, it says, Do not harden your hearts as Israel did at Meribah, as they did at Massah in the wilderness. For there your ancestors tested and tried my patience, even though they saw everything that I did. For 40 years, I was angry with that generation, or them, right? And I said, they are a people whose hearts turn away from me. They refuse to do what I tell them to do. So in my anger, I took an oath, they shall never enter my rest. That entire generation of humans, which will go with 1/3 of 1.2 million people, died in the wilderness because of the actions that were performed during the wilderness season at Meribah and Massah. Now, you've heard this message before, that this is when the judgment concerning the 40 years was determined, not when they stepped towards the promised land. But we do need to ask the question, did they not enter because of that fact? Or did they not enter because he had actually already put in their hearts to be afraid? Or was it a combination of both? Well, however we work it out, we have to at least say that the wilderness season brought about an action that resulted in their carcasses falling in the wilderness, never going to the promised land. Now, why is that so important? Well, because when we are talking about human potential, we need to accept that part of human potential is choice, freedom of choice, free will, right? We've talked a lot about free will, and we're going to get into free will in our discussion a little bit today. But what I really want you to get your minds wrapped around is that this season right now is when it was determined that Israel would not receive the promised land except for Yehoshua and Caleb, except for Joshua and Caleb. 2 people out of 1/3 of 1.2 million people. I'm sorry, 2/3. Okay. Now, why is this so important? Well, first of all, we need to understand that if there is an action of determination as a result of choice that could ripple effect, we would need kind of some proof of that. Well, we have a number of proofs of that. So let's start at the beginning. Let's look at a little bit about with some wave theory. Okay, let's start there. Let's do some wave theory. We'll go ahead and jump into the whiteboard here. Okay, so the way that I want you to think about this is that I have this screen itself right now is a pool of water, okay? Pool of water. And I throw a pebble into this pool of water here. What happens is whatever the actual impact moment was of that in the disturbance of the surface area of this field of water, as the water was displaced by the stone, even though that the stone sank, the entire lake changed its capacity. If you want proof of this, go fill up your bathtub and then jump in it. And when you're cleaning up the water afterwards off of the floor, let's just talk about this for a minute. When you're cleaning up the water afterwards off the floor, you will have already determined that you displaced that water. Well, that's true of even the smallest pebble. The smallest pebble going into the lake that was not there before actually causes the lake to rise. Well, what's interesting is as the pebble pierces through the surface tension of the water, right, there is a displacement of the water in such a way that it goes down. However, it is very fluid, and of course, because the rock is being added to the lake, it comes back up. And so it literally goes whomp, whomp. Well, that results in a wave, right? But what's interesting is it doesn't stop with just one wave. Why? Because this wave is actually traveling outward. And so something very interesting occurs. There's actually proof of what we would call a ripple effect. Now, anything that is stationary on the water, say a boat right here, okay, it looks like a mouse, doesn't it? See if we can get this to look more like a boat. It's not helping. Okay, so the premise is as the wave passes under the boat here, there is a displacement of the boat, right? So the premise is as the wave is coming at the boat here, it actually causes it to rise up. However, the buoyancy of the boat causes it to, or the non-buoyancy of the boat causes it to actually fall back down. So in premise, we could actually illustrate this in terms of the rock going up, I'm sorry, the water going up and down. We'll say that this was where it was at rest. In fact, let's go ahead and just use another color altogether. That's where it's at rest. And we'll say that, so as the rock pushed the water down, it went down. And as the water came back up, it overcompensated, as it were, and then came back around to rest. However, that return on investment, so to speak, actually causes it to go down a little bit more, not as much as before, come up a little bit more, not as much before. And so eventually we have a very small wave. However, the actual wave that went out to begin with has a greater magnitude than the wave that is at the center after we've, say, counted 3 waves. 1, 2, 3. This is higher magnitude than this, which means something that affects a field with some sort of information actually has a greater destructive ability the further out it gets than, or not necessarily destructibility, but it has a greater actual effect upon the things around it than the first, or than the one that's at the center. So as these are going out, this is getting diminished. This right here is diminished. In fact, let's go ahead and say that. I don't know if I spelled that right. Diminished. All right. Now, here is the part that's important. As that's getting diminished, it is important for you to understand that this one is not as much. It's going out at a magnitude that it began with. So here's something interesting about that. If you are a human being, okay, sitting in the center of this decision, you are noticing now, and I'm just going to surround this with yellow, I guess. You are noticing now the calmness of this diminishing wave. But what has gone out is being experienced at the same magnitude that it began, which means as it affects the other things around it, it affects them with the magnitude that it began with. So even after you've calmed down, even after you've quieted your heart, maybe even after you've repented, the wave is still going out at the power that it originally had. And under certain circumstances, depending on inertia, could potentially be stronger than what you already had. And we're not going to talk about resistance today. but resistance can potentially create a larger wave because what was normally under the surface has now begun to cross into the surface but has the same magnitude. And so now, therefore, is a surface wave that is way more intense than the original wave because the original wave was underneath and not necessarily visible. Okay? So I think at the very least, everybody here could agree that that's a pretty intense thought. Now, when we talk about the waters of Meribah, I want you to think about the simplicity of the hardening of the heart, okay? So there's two very important elements that you need to think about: corralling and testing. So corralling is when you actually activate, debate, and use unfair tactics. Testing is when you offer doubt using information to try to what? To try to prove that it is or it is not. Okay? Now, a healthy skeptic will kind of have an ability to look at a situation and ask the questions that need to be asked. However, a demonstration of absolute power is in something very, very important that I think a lot of people miss, and that is the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. So let's start at the beginning. First of all, what amount of energy would be required to maintain a non-entropic? And why do I say that? Because fuel gets consumed and fires die out. A non-entropic energy that was visible as light, that was perceivable as fire, that could be maintained through at least an 8-hour period, depending on the time of year, as a result of when the sun sets or when the sun rises and sets. Because when the sun set to when the sun rose, there was a pillar of fire by night. Do you understand the magnitude of science that would need to go into that energy? A fire maintained, a free energy, if you will, maintained without consumption of fuel in our atmosphere, large enough to be considered a pillar of fire that reached the sky by night, and during the day evidently was vaporous enough or possibly contained enough particulates that it was not visible during the day, but was only visible as a pillar of cloud. Now, I can tell you there's only been one pillar of fire and pillar of cloud that we've experienced in our lifetimes that we could document as real and true as a pillar of cloud and fire, and that is a nuclear weapon. So you see, we could look at the plagues of Egypt with some disdain. We say, why would the Israelites go through the plagues of Egypt? They experienced the plagues of Egypt. It's in some areas, it says even Goshen. And in other areas, it says, I will make a distinction. And so they're going to experience this and you're not. They did not lose their livestock. They did not experience the darkness. So when we're working with this model, you need to understand that it could be determined that Yahweh appears to have an attitude sufficient that the people could question him, except for the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. And interestingly enough, that seems to move around on their behalf, moves between the Israelites and the Egyptians, moves when he wants him to move to another camping area, moves, right? So the people were without excuse. The people were actually experiencing what Paul said. Paul said, the wrath of God is poured out on those who suppress the truth, who, though having a knowledge of God, deny the existence thereof, are without excuse because of what? That which has been made. That which has been made. Okay. So we know that no matter what, this pillar of fire or light, if you will, just so happens to also be the light of the Passover. It seems to have a consciousness in which it determines who would receive its privilege, or maybe that's not the right word, considering that that word's used a lot on the view, but instead we'll say, considering its opportunity to be something else than what is thought to be. Oh, wow, that gets deep. The pillar of fire lets Israel know that their identity is something different than the Egyptians because of the distinction it made. Was it about race? No. Was it about culture? No. However, we do have baby killing. Oh, wait, they not only killed the babies, but they also used the dead baby stuff to perform some sort of ritual in order to provide some sort of longevity. That's right. They were baby killers who wanted to have immortality. But let's say that we exclude that. Let's say that Israel may have been involved in those behaviors as well, because judgment definitely fell on them. And we're dealing with a just God, not a malevolent one. And so what do we need to do? We need to identify that there's actually a context here that everybody was given an opportunity but did not respond correctly to that opportunity. They suppressed the truth, as it were. What was the truth? This pillar of fire. Now, I get it. There are some questions we need to ask about Egypt. There are some questions we need to ask about the behavior of the Israelites in Egypt, and we need to ask about the plagues that fell upon the Israelites. But you cannot deny, nor can you ever refute, the level of intensification of energy that existed as a result of the pillar of fire. There is no actual logical scientific explanation for that phenomenon. And I can tell you, in addition to that, that the ramifications and the implications indicate something way more powerful than anything this earth has ever experienced. And there they are under it, beside it, experiencing whatever it was and the side effects of it. Now, here's the intrigue. The intrigue is that if that's right in front of you, where do you get off saying God brought you out into the wilderness to die? That would have to be the result of something. That would have to be the result of a hardening of a heart. Where does a hardened heart come from? Why does a heart become hard? Because of bitterness. But here's the interesting thing about it. It does not just have to be bitterness as a result of an experience of a long experience of pain. We could instantly, in our hindsight, and our sanctimonious attitudes towards the scripture, say that Israel was a wounded nation and therefore they acted that way. We could say that they acted in their identity as slaves. We could say that they acted in their identity of idolaters. Okay, that's fine. We could do that. But I'm here to tell you that it doesn't necessarily have to be pain. I'm about to prove it to you. So the first thing we need to ask is, What is the difference between good and evil? Well, according to Torah, we're not supposed to ask that question. We are not supposed to know. We are just supposed to exist, and we are supposed to exist as a very specific entity, which I'll get into in a minute. Now, here's the premise. The idea here is that there is a difference between good and evil, but not how you would think. See, evil itself is obviously something to do with constructs. I'm going to show you. So let's start at the beginning. What are we going to do here? We're going to go with this idea here. So how do constructs occur? Well, basically, they're a part of our imagination. Now, but there is something very powerful about our imagination, and that is that we cannot create something out of nothing. We need frames of reference. So we can take a material, we can take an element, we can take a substance, and we can construct it into something else in our minds using new thought. That's how futurists work. That's why we have the technology we have today, is because somebody saw an existing thing and made something out of it that was even greater in its potential and use, right? We see that in the world of medicine. We see that in the world of electronics. We see that in the world of transportation, right? Somebody says, oh, look, fuel burns in this fire. Well, what would happen if I put something, what would happen if I put a pot on it? Oh, look at that. It gets really red hot. What if I put water in it so it doesn't melt? Okay, look at that. Oh, look, it boils. Oh, let's put a lid on top of it and see what happens. Oh, look, it's lifting up off of there. Wow, we have steam pressure. Next thing we have locomotives. And then after that, there's a realization that we don't necessarily need to have steam pressure. We can actually use combustion as a pressure. And then we have the first gas engine. And so there is plenty of imagination, and the context of imagination has to do with new thought, but it's always related to the frame of reference of what we already know. And so over time we say, oh, well, we discovered this, right? We discovered the theory of relativity. We discovered the Planck's constant. We discovered the Higgs field. We discovered we discovered that the Earth is actually heliocentric, and all of the other things that we've discovered. But that's exactly what we did. We discovered them. And once we saw those elements, we began to work with them. A perfect example of that is the atom bomb, right? Which started with the theory of relativity. The idea behind E equals mc squared. So why is this important? Well, when we're talking about imagination, one of the things I want you to think about is that if you're trying to make something out of nothing, it will never happen. But if you're trying to make something out of something, you have to add something to it, and that is actually what? An idea. Well, an idea is basically an inception. It's the beginning of something, right? And you add something to it that already exists, and you have imagination, and that imagination can result in something new in your reality. So when we are working with the concept of evil, recall that we have the drawing of a human head, right? And we have the drawing of a twisted rope. And recall that that means head twists. And here's the interesting thing about it. Head twists, right? But here, now watch this. It actually is the Hebrew word for evil in the English. Okay? which means that you take something that already exists, you put an idea to it, and it now becomes something new. Okay? That is the context or concept of evil in Hebrew understanding. They did not draw the things that would indicate evil. They did not put a weapon in the pictograph. They did not put a bloodshed or a loss in the pictograph. In fact, they didn't even put the thorn in the pictograph, which consequently is the persona of Satan, a thorn that catches the leg and causes you to turn off the path. They didn't put any of that. They put a human head and a twisted rope. Can I not do I have to explain much more than that? That evil is about a construct. So now let's talk a minute about this. When we're dealing with evil, we have three things. We have wounds, we have entitlements, and we have limiting beliefs. Wounds are past tense. You have to go back, get a frame of reference of a wound, and add something in your imagination to it, and then that creates something new. Okay? Entitlements are present tense, observable coveting, observable wanting something that actually is not yours, and then trying to justify why you should have it. Right? That's entitlements. That's a present tense. Future tense, limiting beliefs, beliefs that actually cause you to be limited in your potential. Okay, so wounds, entitlements, limiting beliefs. Well, entitlements is not bitterness or evil per se. It's just a way in which you view yourself, right? Or unfortunately, potentially a way that someone else has built you up. Wounds are a lie. Wounds tell you that you are not worth protecting. And that results in you putting yourself in a position to not be protected. Entitlements tell you you deserve something you don't. And so you put yourself in a position to deserve things you don't. Limiting beliefs tell you you can accomplish something that you can. You can't accomplish something that you can. And so you what? Put yourself in a position to fail. Now, those particular items are all wrong imaginations about something that already exists. For example, a wound. A person causes harm to another in some form, whether it be physical, psychological, emotional, or spiritual harm. They then what? Have told that person through their actions that they don't deserve to be protected by the one who did the action. Because I can tell you right now, it is the greater in a malevolent form who injures another. It is not the weaker who injures the greater. It is always the greater. It is the position of trust. It is the position of protection. It is the position of power that exploits and manipulates, coerces, and forces the weaker, the lesser, to not only not be protected by them, but to somehow be what? Used by them. So they're looked at as a resource and not something else, which we're going to look at today. So wounds are powerful because why? They have communicated information through experience. And I remind you, there's three knowledges. There is spiritual knowledge, written knowledge, and experiential knowledge. Spiritual knowledge being unctions, written knowledge being the wisdom literature of the world, as it were, right? The scripture, the proverbs, the wisdoms of the different cultures, right? And then there's experiential knowledge, which eliminates all of them. And experiential knowledge will override unction. And experiential knowledge will override scripture. And what I mean by that is you could tell a person all day that God loves them, but if they have experienced a lack of love in their life, they're going to have a hard time believing it no matter what the Bible says. And if you were to accidentally stumble upon the skepticism of the Bible, textual criticism alone will cause you to not believe that that book is actually telling the truth. People claim it's telling the truth, but my point is that experiential knowledge does not necessarily demonstrate that. Does it make it wrong or right? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, when you experience a bad situation, and Scripture says that you weren't supposed to go through that bad situation, and you experience it anyways, you stop believing in Scripture, not your own experience, right? Okay, so the reason that this is important is because now, as we're getting into the discussion of evil, we're getting into the discussion of wounds, right? Entitlements and limiting beliefs. So what do we say a wound really is? It's an opinion about yourself as a result of the action that somebody did to you. Okay? Entitlements is actually an opinion about yourself that does not reflect your actual merit. Now, we'll talk a minute about merit here. First and foremost, let's make something abundantly clear. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. What does that mean? That means that the actual status that we hold has nothing to do with what we could or could not do. However, within the context of social justice, there is a reward and consequence system called blessing and curse, and very specifically, we call it reciprocation, or what? Reaping what you sow. Now, we know that there are seasons of sowing and reaping, but you need to understand those seasons become infinitely small and infinitely big. For example, there's a Jubilee of Jubilee years, which is what? 50-year seasons. That's a really big number, right? That's a really big amount of time. But then there's also a Shabbat, which is a miniature Moedim, a miniature feast day. And that miniature feast day is weekly. And so you actually go through all 7 feasts in a week, right? And so you go through a little Yom Kippur, you go through a little Passover, you go through a number of feast days within the week as a microscopic cycle of the grander scheme of the Moedim. Oh, guess what? There's also a daily cycle of this same thing. So what's my point? My point is that when we're working with a system that says you have merit, we need to understand that it's about reciprocation, that it will be returned upon you what you put upon another. And it will be returned upon you how you treat another. In fact, it will be returned upon you so thoroughly that there are some faiths, some traditions that say that you actually get more than that. Now, Torah says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but that doesn't necessarily equate to the magnitude of the impact for the person, because depending on how hard your heart is how much of an effect a reciprocation will have upon you. There are many people that say, oh yeah, you know what, that wasn't really that bad of a spanking. And the next guy that comes along goes, if I have to go through that ever again, I'm going to die, right? So there's perception involved. Now, the reason why this is so important is because when we get into entitlements, we need to understand that what it is it is a belief that you deserve something through reciprocation as a result of an imbalance. What it is it's an inappropriate weights and balances. It's saying, yes, I actually deserve that thing, even though all I did was this little thing. Remember, I told you that if we fill your box with all the good you've done, I will empty it with your lack of merit. I will take every single action that you don't remember or don't realize you did, or better yet, do realize you did but have been lying to yourself, and dismiss every one of those pretty little things you put in that box that make you think you're good. There is only one that's good. Now, don't get me wrong, I have made statements along the lines of saying, you're a good person. I've said, you know what, you're a really good person. But you need to understand the context by which I identify that in a human, and that is, he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. Yeshua walks into a crowd of Jews. Why do we know it's Jews? Because at the end of the sermon, right? At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, they say, he speaks as one with authority, not like our teachers. There's your indication. We're not talking about the Greeks here. We're talking about Jews. What does he tell them? Okay, what do they believe about him first? First of all, they're in shock. They're in shock of who he actually is in terms of how he speaks, right? He doesn't talk like the rabbis, right? He doesn't talk like the leaders of the synagogue. He doesn't talk like the scribes. He talks like one of who has authority, as if he was a king or something. But they don't actually identify him as the Messiah. Why? Because we never get the Hosanna thing going, right? We never get the Hoshiana to the Son of David until the triumphal entry. And so from that point of view, they're considering it, they're stroking their beards, but they don't actually know what he is. And what does he tell that group of people who are unbelievers and sinners and who have not been redeemed by grace through faith, through only Christ, through only the scripture, as Luther would like to claim? He tells them they are the light of the world. Now in John chapter 1, it says that John himself did not believe that he himself was the light, but came to testify of the light or bear witness of the light, which we could talk about that in a whole nother level of quantum. But I can tell you, until Yeshua tells them, they did not know it. But he says it to a group of unbelievers, which tells me to use After Heart Ministry to tell people that they are the light, regardless of whether they've gone through the Christian essentials. Now, does that make them redeemed? Does that put them under the covenant of Israel? Does that do the things, or maybe I should call it the renewed covenant, right? Jeremiah 31 through 33. Behold, I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with their fathers, right? Not that covenant, right? Consequently, the covenant that Yeshua said, take this cup, drink it, for it is the new covenant sealed in my blood. Yeah, that covenant. The covenant that you hear about when you're sitting in the pew on Sunday morning, not when you're sitting in the synagogue on Saturday morning. That covenant doesn't equate in this situation. Why? Because the light of the world doesn't necessarily have to do with redemption. It has to do with potential. You have the potential to be this thing. Energy, when it is calculated, is kinetic energy plus potential energy. Potential energy plays a role in all of this. And so we need to start to get our minds wrapped around the difference, okay? All right, so when we're talking about entitlements, you are saying that you are what? You are merited to something you are not. And here's the crazy part about it. You will find a justification. You will say, I deserve that thing because of this. And a lot of times, interestingly enough, it's a wound. So, now, if we combine that and we say, okay, a wound could result in an entitlement, well, interestingly enough, we could also identify that a wound could result in a limiting belief. Oh, but it gets better. An entitlement could result in a wound. I won't get into that today. But my point is they can potentially contribute to each other, which makes a vicious cycle. But now let's talk about limiting beliefs. So the Israelites go to the edge of the promised land. Now, granted, Yahweh has already determined they're not going in. You see, that's the part that people don't realize. That's the part that people don't get their heads wrapped around. And I'm telling you, when I finally hooked on to Meribah and realized the ramifications of it, I got scared. I was like, oh my gosh. It happened before they ever got there. They had already hardened their hearts. Now, we're going to talk about that more in a minute. But the premise is that the hardened heart did not result in just bitterness, okay? The hardened heart can result in entitlements. So limiting beliefs. So they come to the edge of the promised land, they go in, they spy it out, they see there's giants in the land, we're grasshoppers in their eyes. So there's what? There's the Amalekites, there's the Anakim, right? There's the Nephilim, there's the Agagites, right? All of these different scary people, however they were scary, whether it was because they were magicians and they had powers, or whether it was because they were taller or bigger, or whether it was because they had bigger armies and maybe had more affluent, right? Maybe more affluential kings. Regardless, this is what they say. They say, our children will be a prey. They will prey on our children. Why? Because those nations practiced child sacrifice in order to preserve longevity. They would what? They would do horrible things while they were alive and then cut their throats and get the blood and drink it. And then they would burn their bodies while they were alive sometimes until they were destroyed. And the essence of their body was supposed to satiate these gods that they were worshiping. So, of course, they say our children are going to be a prey to them. Well, in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 39, it says, your children, whom you said will be a prey, though not knowing good and evil, they shall go in and possess it. Limiting beliefs. We can't do it. Wait a minute. Okay, hold on. Were you able to do it when you were in Egypt? Because I don't think you were. Last time I checked, you did not deliver yourselves from Egypt per se. Now, granted, they walked out, and that was big. That was a change in status and identity and belief. Because the truth is, they could have walked out at any time, and Yahweh still would have protected them the way that He did when the Egyptians pursued them. That magnitude of deliverance did not exist as a condition of the plagues being activated. If Israel would have accepted their identity that they were Yahweh's, they could have walked out after the first plague, or better yet, when Pharaoh said, "Go make straw," and don't, guess what? I'm not giving you straw anymore. You go gather that straw and you make brick. If they would have realized their identity or status at that moment, they would have said, hey, yeah, see you later, bud. But the truth is that they had to have a demonstration that they could deliver themselves, that they could walk out, because the Egyptians were so fearful of them. But really, that was just information. They were the same human being, the same state of mind. Listen, how many of you go through this honeymoon period? You come and you accept Christ, and all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to quit cursing. I'm going to buy a bunch of Bibles. I don't know how much money I spent on Bibles the first time, but I can tell you it was really, really expensive. And I'm going to quit cursing, and I'm going to do all these good things, and then all of a sudden life hits, bam. And when life hits, you're like, oh, whoa, foul, filth. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, I must not be saved. That's exactly how that goes. But what they did is they said, no, we are actually the children of God, and we will walk out of Egypt. And then the pillar of fire says, and the pillar of cloud says, and now all of a sudden, out in the middle of nowhere, nobody is allowed to cross that boundary. That could have happened before the plagues ever even started. All they had to do is get up and walk out. Now, the limiting belief that they believed that they could not enter the promised land. Was it the result of what happened at Meribah? Yes, but only because of the hardness of the heart. And then Yahweh gave them what they wanted. Remember, all creation is conspiring on what? Behalf of the sons of Adam to be unconditionally obedient to him, because it was subject to his dominion. So everything in the universe will give you what you actually ask for, which usually is not what your words say, but instead what your actions demonstrate. And so now we could get into magnetism and attraction and all these other things, but it is very important for you to understand that when we are working with this model, we are working with an identity. They could have walked out of Egypt. They could have. So they hardened their hearts at Meribah. How did they do that? God brought us out here into the wilderness to die. There wasn't enough graves. Let's go look at it. That's going to be in Exodus chapter 16. Now, I think there's a number of things that are important here, and that is that we understand that the Israelites actually just came through the Red Sea. They camped at the palms, right? The 7 palms oasis, which an oasis has an interesting thing that occurs, and it's crazy because it actually has something to do with volcanoes. I won't necessarily get into that, but I can tell you that there's these little pockets of underwater filtration systems that desalinate seawater from the seas that surround the deserts, right? And then result in these interior locations that have fresh water that's drinkable, right? And the premise is that in all of that desalination and then that result in that, and there's just this abundance of plants to eat from and foliage and all this stuff right in the middle of the desert. So they're at this oasis, they leave this oasis, right? And we come to chapter 16, verse 3. If only Yahweh had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you have brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death. Okay. Now there is a part of me that wants to say that regardless of a pillar of fire, regardless of a massive amount of destruction of infrastructure, destruction of national product, destruction of personal property, destruction of the integrity of the family, results in the destruction of a nation, had already occurred in Egypt, and they witnessed that, and they saw how Yahweh made a distinction between Israel and Egypt, between he who wrestles with God and the binding limitations. They saw how he delivered them from that. That there could still be, in my mind, as I get hungry and hangry, a possibility that I might say something irrational to the people around me and might even accuse people of things that I normally probably wouldn't accuse them of if I wasn't so hungry. But we need to kind of explain and understand the hardening of the heart. So let's say that we get through this idea of limiting beliefs. Limiting beliefs is just believing that you can't do something that you can. Look, they are the nation of Israel. They had plenty of evidence that they could go into the promised land and take it. It was promised, for one, by the intensification of all power in the universe. It was promised. How many promises do you have, and you still try to become reactive, even though that you have those promises to your current circumstances, as if somehow that promise wasn't going to happen? In fact, you get yourself worked up. Oh, if that doesn't happen, how angry I'll be. Roar, I'm angry now. Well, why are you angry now? Because you already lived through that circumstance the wrong way. So now the premise is that as we go through this thought process, we need to accept that we're going to have a little bit of empathy for hungry people and their desperation. But we need to accept that according to Yahweh, they hardened their hearts. Okay? So we saw that part about them not having the food to eat, right? And we know, hindsight being 2020, that we actually have manna coming down, right? And manna creates three very important principles. One, that the promise was being kept. So man shall not live on bread alone, but every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God, which is a promise, right? I will is probably the greatest and most effective statement that Yahweh uses in almost all of his interactions with people. And then what? The second is it establishes the Sabbath. It falls when? It falls on Friday afternoon in a double portion and results in enough to be left over onto Saturday morning. And unlike the other days where it was left over and had worms, on Saturday morning it did not. And so as a result of that, they had the establishment of the 7-day cycle and the Shabbat. Now the bread from heaven is being obedient to Shabbat more than the children of men are. And then the final one is that they had food. They had the satiation. But that's hindsight, right? They didn't know this. They're going through what they're going through. Well, then in chapter 17, there is a change, right? What is that change? There is an attitude that is brought forth. Therefore, this is 17:2. Therefore, the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test Yahweh?" But the people thirsted for water, and they grumbled against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to Yahweh, saying, "What shall I do to this people? A little more, and they will stone me." And Yahweh said to them, "Pass before me and the people, and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand your staff, which you struck the Nile, and go. And behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, and then the people may drink." And he named the place Massa and Meribah. Now, two very important things that we need to do then. We need to accept that this is the moment when they hardened their hearts. So what was the difference between the manna and the water? Well, I'm just gonna put it to you like this. I can say in its simplicity that they should never have had the unction to complain after the manna fell from the idea that they weren't going to receive what they needed. They needed water. So was water coming? Yep. They needed food. Was food coming? Yep. They were afraid of the Amalekites. Was the deliverance coming? Yep. Now, here's the part that's important. The waters of Meribah are where the hardening of the heart occurs. So let's talk about a hardening heart when it comes to wounds. There's no question in my mind that damage done to another person by another person results in a ripple effect that cannot be understood. Because by the time it begins to affect the people who are on the outskirts of the original offense has dissipated. Now, there's some very important things you need to understand about that. That means that life can kind of start to get back to normal, and it's still affecting people out here. Now, wounds have a tendency to cause a person to believe that they don't deserve something. Now, generally speaking, our demeanor, our temperament, that's the word I'm thinking of. Our temperament will dictate how we respond to a wound. The same way that an army would respond to an approaching army. Now you know a bigger and badder army is coming towards your camp. Now you have three options. You can flee, you can surrender, or you can fight. And if you're going to fight, you probably should start it first. And so what's interesting is this, in the same way, when we experience the cognitive dissonance of our soul saying, wait a minute, he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. You are not this thing. So cognitive dissonance occurs, and all of a sudden you say, okay, I think I'm this thing, but my mind is saying something different. How do you respond? Well, there are people who will pretend like the conflict doesn't even exist. I can tell you that those people usually end up as addicts. Wounded people who are addicts have the demeanor or the temperament of retreat. Okay? Some people end up as counter attackers. They're going to attack first. They're going to what? Become very, very, very aggressive towards the identity that's asserting itself. And so they're going to overcompensate and become the opposite of it. So if the offender caused the person to think they're weak, they become the strongest person that they know and very possibly disdain the weak, including themselves. I'll get to that. Now, then there is the one who surrenders. Yes, I have been victimized. Yes, I am not worthy. Therefore, I will live my life demonstrating that I am not worthy. Okay? Now, I can tell you where the person who runs away will end up as an addict if they do not heal from their wounds. The person who becomes the counterattacker will very possibly become the monster that caused the problem in the first place. And then those who surrender will become the victim who what? Becomes entitled. The reason for this is because now the victim believes that they are what? Not worthy of protection, and therefore they'll put themselves in positions where they don't deserve protection, but they will have an expectation of those things. They will say, well, I deserve this because this happened to me. Okay? So the hardening of the heart is where the information of he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, the lamb slain from the foundations of the earth, communicating through our DNA and epigenetics that we are not a victim, that we are not somebody who's not worthy of protection. Whether you counterattack it, whether you surrender to it, or whether you run from it, you are not identifying the simple fact that it's a lie. And so the hardening of the heart is a not believing the promise, not believing the truth. Remember, it says, not all Israel are Israel, who are the bloodline, but it is actually the sons of promise who are Israel. Just like it says, through Isaac shall your name be called. What happens with Jacob and Esau? And so the premise is that as we make an adjustment in that process, we realize that it is actually a promise that was actually kept from the foundations of the earth, asserting itself upon your reality. Why? Because your very DNA is inscripted with the promises of who you really are. In fact, we do things as human beings to act like who we really are, and we don't understand why we're doing them. Why is there an entire concert of planets in frequency sounds long before we ever existed, long before music had its evolutions that it has had, and yet today we compose music? Because we're trying to act like that which created the planets. We're trying to be like God, right? Okay. So now what we need to do is we need to talk about entitlements in terms of hardening of heart. If you feel entitled to something and you don't receive it, you're going to what? Be reactive to it. Some people would call that a spoiled brat, But I'm going to say it a different way. I'm going to say that if there's an expectation to receive something that you believe you deserve when you don't necessarily deserve it, you can deceive yourself into believing that you deserve it. Now, we know that could potentially be as a result of a wound where you feel entitled to something because of something bad that happened to you. That's a chip on your shoulder, right? But the premise is that the way the universe works is you reap and you sow. So if you want something, you sow, right? If you want a crop to grow, you don't sit there and say, you know what, I was victimized when I was 5 years old, and the horrible things that happened to me, you are supposed to grow, you stupid crop. No, we go plant seeds, right? You plant seeds and you receive back. That's how it works, right? Don't get me wrong, the unmerited favor, or what we would call the imputation of Yeshua, identifies you as an equal distributor of wealth, which means you should have abundance in order to distribute that wealth. That doesn't entitle you to anything because of something you've done. You don't get to tell that crop to grow because you got owie. Okay? Don't get me wrong. I have an extraordinary amount of empathy for those who have been hurt and told that there's something they're not. But don't think for a second that merits you to something that you did not yourself sow first. Okay, because God knows if it was the other way around and somebody sowed something bad, you would definitely accept them to have a reciprocation, wouldn't you? But you can't think of that type of merit when it comes to your part. Now, that's how the heart hardens there. But it's the same principle. It's the information saying, you don't deserve it. I'm giving it freely. But you in your mind say, no, it's because I did this good thing. That's why I deserve it. And it's not on time, so therefore I'm mad. On what time? On the time that you've determined that you think that it's supposed to be here. Entitlement. Sick, right? Where do you get off thinking you deserve to have something that you did not yourself sow? And where do you get off thinking that that's a free gift without imputation? Do you realize, for those of you who are non-believers, who are atheists, who watch my show or watch my YouTube channel because maybe you like how I integrate science into metaphysics, you cannot have that freeness of unmerited. You can't add to nor take away from the title without Yeshua. Meaning what? You need the Lamb who was slain from the foundations of the earth to have done what he did. And guess what? I'll bet you if you began to apply your physics equations to that process, you might find something at the beginning of the universe that seems to indicate that that's true all the way through. But the premise is that you actually don't deserve the things that you have. I get reciprocation. If you sowed and you have reaped, fine. But not because you have been hurt or wounded, and not because you think that you are self-righteous. You have not demonstrated righteousness because you have not resisted the sin unto the shedding of blood. That's what Hebrews says. Okay. Now we get into something interesting. Now we get into the concept of how Israel was supposed to think versus how they think. And that there's actually a commandment that is indicative that you actually should be looking at yourself a certain way. So let's talk a minute about the concept of introspection, okay? Introspection is where you inspect the interior of you, okay? That's where you go and you look at the darkness. That's shadow work, right? You look at the darkness and you say, I would love to change that. I need to repent from that at Yom Kippur. It's the 40 days of introspection. 40 days before Yom Kippur, this begins. You're looking at the shadows. You're looking at the things that are defects of character that could potentially create ripples. Let me go to the right screen. Ripples. Something that could create ripples. And those ripples, unfortunately, as I've demonstrated, are more destructive or at least more reductive in positive energy than we would have ever thought. Okay. So let's go to Leviticus. And the only reason I stopped to think about that is because I'm not sure whether or not I want to stop and split the parts here. But I think we need to actually establish some foundational groundwork here. So now we're in Leviticus chapter 23, and we're working through these feast days, right? And we've come to Passover. We've come and gone. Passover's come and gone. We're in the middle of unleavened bread. And it says, on the 15th day of the same month, there is a feast of unleavened bread to Yahweh. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work. But for 7 days you shall present an offering by fire to Yahweh. On the 7th day is a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you enter the land which I'm going to give you and you reap its harvest, then you shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. You shall wave the sheaf before Yahweh for you to be accepted. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. Now on the day when you wave the sheaf, you shall offer a male lamb 1 year old without defect, a burnt offering to Yahweh. Its grain offering shall then be 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, an offering by fire to Yahweh for a soothing aroma, and its drink offering 1/4 of a hin of wine. Until this same day, until you have brought the offering of your Elohim, you shall eat neither bread nor roasted grain nor new growth. It is to be a perpetual statute throughout your generations in all your dwelling places. You shall also count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day when you brought in the sheaf of the wave offering, there shall be 7 complete Sabbaths. You shall count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall present a new grain offering to Yahweh. You shall bring in from your dwelling places 2 loaves of bread for a wave offering made with 2/10 of an ephah, and they shall be of fine flour baked with leaven as first fruits to Yahweh. Along with bread, you shall present 7 1-year-old male lambs without defect, a bull of the herd, and 2 rams, and they are to be burnt offering to Yahweh with your grain offering and their drink offerings, an offering by fire of soothing aroma to Yahweh. You shall also offer 1 male goat for a sin offering, and 2 male goats, and 2 lambs for 2 male lambs 1 year old for a sacrifice of peace offerings. Then the priest shall then wave them with the bread and the first fruits for a wave offering, with 2 lambs before Yahweh. They are to be holy to Yahweh for the priest. On this same day, you shall make a proclamation as well. You are to have a holy convocation. You shall do no laborious work. It is to be a perpetual statute in all your dwelling places throughout your generations. Did I not tell you earlier that there was a micro jubilee? Did I not tell you earlier that there was a large jubilee, and then there were smaller jubilees, and that those jubilees had something to do with the context of jubilee? Well, what is the context of Jubilee? The context of Jubilee is about liberty, about a release of debt, right? And in that release of debt, there is a necessity for you to return the original property back to the individual. Now, that's the 50 year, that's 7 Shemitas. A Shemitah is a 7-year period. So you have 1 Shemitah is 7 years, 7 of those, and then 1 more year is Jubilees. It happens usually once and possibly potentially twice in your lifetime. During that time, all land that has been lended in or has been used as a collateral for loans is returned to the customer. Returned to its original owner. I don't know why I said customer. Okay. So what you need to know is that the smaller Jubilee has something within it that's important. To really, really get your mind wrapped around that, what we need to do is we need to look at the idea of the release of debt or consideration for business dealings as being an instruction built into Torah to tell you to release something. And I'm going to get to it in a moment. But the way that we're going to go through this is by looking at the Hebrew where it says, you shall count for yourselves. So let's go look. In the Hebrew, this is what it says. Safar. Okay? Safar. Now it says to recount or count or relate. Okay? And it's the idea of communication. But the premise is that Safar is actually the concept of to score with a mark as a tally or record, by implication to inscribe, also to enumerate intensively or to recount, for example, to celebrate, to commune, right? To declare, number with a penknife, to reckon, ascribe, to show forth, speak, talk, tell, out, or a writer. In the Ethiopic, or what we call Amharic, it means to measure, okay? To measure. And it's diminutive from Sefer, so we can look at Sefer real quick, which is a book, right? It's a document. But there's something else present in here that's important. And that is that it says right here, lechem. So it says, usfartem, which is what? It is second person plural, right? So this is you all, whoops. This is you all. And so what we need to think about is this is not just a single individual, this is a community. So let's talk a minute about you all. How many people need to be present for the word you all to be used? Some people would say only two, because if you are referring to a group of people and you say you all, then that at least requires two. But the thing you're not taking into consideration is yourself. And so really there needs to be three present in order for the word you all to be used. The one who is giving the imperative or giving the commandment, and then the at least two who are involved. Well, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Where two or three are gathered in my name, so there am I. Okay, interesting. So when we see you all, we need to realize that it is community-based. It doesn't say you all in the sense of it being a individual, but instead you all. Now, interestingly enough, in the English it says yourselves, and the reason for that has to do with this right here, okay? This is lechem. Now, not to be confused with lechem, which is bread, but lechem, okay? Lechem. Now, there's a little bit of a ch there, but you can barely hear it. But what is it? It's a preposition that means for the sake of. This lamed right here, not about that part, but this part, this lamed right here. That lamed means for the sake of whom? You all. Masculine plural. Or you men, as it were. But we're not going to get into that context. So what's the point? You are to recount or recollect, or you are to communicate in such a way as to measure for yourselves, right? And then this is what it says. From the day after the Shabbat, right? and measure for yourselves after the day of the Shabbat. And then, of course, when you bring in the offering now, or the wave offering. Now, what's important here is that you are actually doing something during these days. You are measuring something. But what's interesting is it is not introspection. And this is where we make the mistake. It is not introspection. Introspection is where you look within and you see the things that you need to take to Yom Kippur and demonstrate that you want to change from. Okay? But on the other hand, what we have here is we have the sentiment or the premise of reflection. Now, the way that I want you to think about reflection is it has to do with the angular, the angle of light. So when we're working with this thought process, what you need to realize is that you are looking at something and you are observing it in a mirror, okay? So if you step before a mirror, you check and see, okay, yep, I see my beard's a little bit unbalanced, so I'm going to pull some of this side out and I'm going to get it straight, right? Or maybe my keeper's on, back crooked or whatever. I look in the mirror and I see, right? I see my shoulders, I see my chest, I see my stomach, I see the me, right? But it is the me that is reflected. Now, I want you to understand, during the wilderness season, you are to be counting these things. You need to understand that during the wilderness season, you are to count these 50 days. So what are you supposed to do during these 50 days? Well, let me tell you the mistake that almost the entire world of Torah has made. The entire world of Torah has treated this as an introspection. I want you to look into the mirror and see what you don't like. But in times past, I've taught you that the Passover season lasts from Passover all the way to Pentecost. So let me just show you this really quick. I know some of you are sick of this diagram, so I'm just gonna do it real quick. You guys know this. You guys know what I'm drawing here, right? You know that this is Passover. I'm just going to put Passover. Here I'm going to put Pentecost, right? And here I'm going to put Tabernacles. But what am I stating? I am stating that from here to here is the season of Passover, and from here to here is the season of Pentecost. And a lot of people don't know it, but this is the season of Tabernacles, which could get into a lot of ramifications. But the premise is that there is a season that passes all the way through. Okay, now what does that mean? Well, when we go back to the wedding elements, we've got what? We've got the Shidduchim. What is the Shidduchim? The Shidduchim is the matchmaking. Meaning what? Say matchmaker. Meaning what? Well, when we are looking at the Shidduchim, we understand that it's the choosing of the bride. So what's happening during the wilderness season? What is not appropriate for her is being exposed. Does she need to look into herself to see that exposure? Nope. The wilderness season is going to bring the worst of her out, right? However, what causes her to be beautiful is actually what is on the interior and needs to come out, right? So it's interesting. In one respect, we are looking into the introspection and trying to find the shadows for Yom Kippur. That's the 40 days of introspection. But during the 50 days or the Jubilee of the counting of the Omer, which is basically the measuring of the days, we're doing something very different. Why? Because what does the wilderness season have? The wilderness season has hunger answered by thirst. I'm sorry, answered by satiety. The thirst answered by quenching, and fear answered by deliverance. And so when we're dealing with the wilderness season, we have this negative and we have this positive, and they balance, right? They balance. But a response to it, for example, the people that say, he brought us out here into the wilderness to die, have hardened their hearts against the identity that's demonstrated by the pillar of cloud. You see, that cloud would not be there if they were not his people. And if they're not his people, then I could understand them coming out into the wilderness and starving. But the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud are proof that they are his people and therefore will be taken care of. Well, that mentality only fell upon two men, didn't it? Joshua and Caleb are the only ones who not only went into the promised land and came back courageous, but who passed the test of Meribah and Massah. Because we know that the generation who did not pass the test of Meribah and Massah are the ones who would not go into the promised land. And he was angry with that generation for 40 years. He wasn't angry with Joshua, and therefore they had maintained their faith even during Meribah and Massah. You will not find that taught from any other platform. That Joshua and Caleb knew the manna and the water were coming. And Joshua was the one that ran out into the battle with the Amalekites. Joshua was the one that said, I will go and I will deliver the Israelites who don't believe their identity. Right? Even though he knew that they would die in the wilderness. How did he know? Because his own mind, his own thoughts, his own soul knew that it was the faithfulness of believing that the manna would come, believing that the water would come. He didn't know what would come, but he believed something would come. That was an elevation. That was a demonstration of the true bride, right? The faithful one. The one who would stand upon the promise of the ketubah. How would they stand upon the promise of the ketubah? They say, yes, my husband will deliver me. Now you say, well, wait a minute, that's not how that went. Well, yes, it was, because it says not in Jeremiah chapter 31 through 34, it says, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers, which they broke, even though I was a husband to them. Okay, now, if we are to measure those days, and it seems as though the deliverance of those days is to not harden your heart, then you have to rise above something. Then that means that you're operating in a very different realm from the things that you're experiencing. What do I mean by that? I mean that you are actually rising above it with a sound mind. Yeah, kinda, but more than that. You see, I want to remind you about the ripple here. It can appear, here, let me go ahead and jump over here. And I'll put some marks here. It can very much and very easily appear that when you are in this spot, that the light of Passover does not have the magnitude that it had, because the ripple is getting less, it's diminishing. But as it's going out and affecting everything around it, it's maintaining its magnitude. What does that mean? That means that we need to keep moving with the wave. Now, here's the part that's interesting about this. If we're moving with the wave, then we are moving with the light. Then we need to understand the light in the perspective of its attributes. Now, when Kabbalists count the Omer, they will say, today is the energy of mercy within mercy. Now, let's talk a minute about mercy. There are two very important attributes to mercy that have to be accepted as axioms of its reality. Number one is that someone is guilty of a violation of the law or violation of instruction or commandment. And number two, that the extent of the law will not be applied. So how can we put this? A man murders another man, lies in wait, and kills that man, right? So he is guilty of murder under the guises of Torah. If he lies in wait and intentionally kills him, then he's guilty of murder and he shall be put to death. However, the person who actually activates that death is the avenger of blood, who is a kinsman of the one who was killed. So now there is a premise that somebody could run and grab the horns of the altar of God and cry out for mercy, asking for protection from the intensification of all power in the universe, regardless of the behavior that they have that has caused them to flee there in the first place. In other words, there is a possibility for mercy when there's murder. Where's our proof in that? Well, you got, come on. David is our poster child, right? Now, the premise is that mercy exists as an energy and an intelligence. In other words, mercy itself is a conscious energy in the universe that is an emanation, right? Something that flows from something to something else is an emanation of the intensification of all power in the universe, whose nature, right, whose divine nature is benevolent. Mercy is the first and foremost perceivable attribute of Yahweh. Why do I say that? I say that because he has made exceptions to his Torah so many times in Scripture, it will shock you. People say, oh, the law was not doable. Okay, fine. I'm not going to argue that point today. I've argued it on other days. But let's say that it wasn't. What is the absolute truth concerning Torah? That the fullest extent of it is a reciprocation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. And therefore, there is a context that if there is a life for a life, then there needs to be a killing of the person who killed. However, there are multiple instances where that was not the case. That is mercy. Did you know this actually exists in our law in America today? Did you know that if a man is executed in a prison as a result of a death sentence carried out in obedience to the instruction of a judge, the death certificate will say they were murdered, homicide. Why? Because another human killed another human. Now, where does the mercy come in? Because that person didn't lie in wait. Sure, no, that's not true, right? We sat there the night before and asked you, what did you want to eat? Because I'm going to kill you in the morning, right? So now all of a sudden there's a mercy applied to the person committing that crime because of the justification of why it's occurring. So what's my point? My point is that mercy is applied first, but mercy is applied to a fault without any other balance. So now when we get into the idea of a Kabbalah saying today is the energy, and by the way, that's day one of the counting of Omer, is mercy within mercy. Today is the energy of mercy within mercy. Guess what they do? They try to activate mercy within mercy in their behavior that day. Whereas introspection is a time where they look into their heart. And when I say they, I mean people who are honoring Torah and believe that they should introspect in order to come before Yom Kippur with the purest of hearts, are looking for the attributes that they want to take and lay at the altar of Yom Kippur and say, have mercy on me. During the counting of Omer, there's an elevation, and that elevation is that you actually activate the light of Passover by acting out the attributes of the intensification of all power in the universe. Mercy, judgment, victory, humility, beauty. And in that way, there is actually a balance occurring in the universe, but furthermore, you're activating the light of Passover. Moving through the wilderness with the wave. Moving with the pillar of cloud, right? Moving with, I don't think the pillar of fire ever moved, but I think the pillar of cloud did. Moving with the wave, moving with the energy, moving with the moment. You know, when we look at 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3, I call this the easy button, right? You guys remember the easy button from the Staples commercials? Seeing that his divine power, okay, let's talk about that for a moment. Power here in the Hebrew, power here in the Hebrew is going to be dunamis. Okay? So let's just for a moment focus on dunamis. Right here in, right there. Dunamis. Okay? Power. Wrong one. There we go. Power right here. Strong's Concordance 1411. You should memorize that number. And you should be able to speak about what I'm about to speak about because it's very powerful. So dunamis, right? Which is strength or power, right? But let's get some context on that strength or power. Well, the best place to find that is actually in the moment with the woman who has the issue of blood. In Luke chapter 8, right? Let's read it. And a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and could not be healed by anyone, came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. And Yeshua said, "Who is the one who touched me?" And while they were all denying it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing on you." But Yeshua said, "Someone did touch me, for I was aware that the power had gone out from me." Here you go. Dunamis. Okay? So let's be clear on what type of energy we're talking about here. The power to heal, the power to create, the power to alter the course of a natural order process or something that is occurring in a certain way, like a ripple. The power to do something different. In fact, it is called miracles in Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Let's go look at that one real quick. Matthew 7, going down to verse 21. That's not 7. I must have picked the wrong one. There we go. Matthew 7, verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not cast out demons in your name? Did we not perform many works of power? Dunamis. So you see the energy that I'm talking about that we follow with the light of Passover. How do we know? Well, we could probably get with some of the scientific explanations for the Passover, like the bacteria and the dying of the fish, and then the frogs themselves and the lice and all that. But there's three really big ones that are probably extremely important in our context here. But let's go with the death of the firstborn. That's definitely not something necessarily that could be explained. Now, they say that it's possible that the firstborn got the bread first, and therefore they got the bacteria first. That's fine. But what about the darkness that could be felt? And what about the distinction between the two? There is no greater unexplainable in quantum mechanics, physics, and astrophysics than the darkness and the difference between them. Because we could do an eclipse, but truth be told, that's actually not accurate because it could be felt. This is a very different kind of darkness, isn't it? Yes, it is. And no matter what you try to do to try to explain it away, you can never feel darkness. Now, you could feel a fear of darkness. That's legit. But this was something you actually tactilely could discern. Okay? So we could do all that stuff and try to explain all that stuff, but in the end, there is a power in the light of Passover that, unfortunately, depending on the setting of your heart, seems to do some pretty funky stuff. The light of Passover is what brought manna. And I'm going to propose to you, and this is going to be powerful, that the reason why the people got manna is because Joshua and Caleb. Because why throw them under the bus? Because of what they're doing. See, that's human thinking that thinks that, oh, well, when a majority does something wrong, we should punish the whole entire lot. That's human thinking. But mercy says that because Joshua and Caleb did not sin, they deserve the manna. But can you rain manna just down on 110? I suppose you could. But all that's going to do is make the people worse. They had to have the opportunity to experience the blessing that everybody else had experienced. Because the manna was based upon when Yeshua, what? Was made to be sin that we might become the righteousness of God. Manna was not about merit. Manna was coming. We know it was because Joshua and Caleb believed it. Manna was coming because there was a pillar of fire on top of the tabernacle, which defies all thoughts about how fire and air and other things work. Okay? So, when we are actually looking into the mirror of the attributes of Yahweh, which I'm going to get back to the easy button in a minute, okay? When we are looking into the mirror of the attributes of Yahweh, we need to understand that one of the biggest principles of it is the light of Passover, okay? When I say principles, what I mean is what causes the reality of those attributes to activate within us is actually the light of Passover, which is the light of the Messiah. So here we go. Seeing that his divine power has granted to us everything pertaining to life. Whoa. So dunamis is granted us everything pertaining to life and godliness, which consequently this word theotis, very powerful word actually, theotis, right here, godliness. I'm sorry, not theotis, Eusebius, or Eusebia. which is a reverent respect, right? Or piety or godliness, used 15 times, right? But in general is a higher level of existence. In fact, when we're dealing with, let's see, here we go. The mystery, which is held by godliness and nourishes it, right? And so let me tell you what it's not. It's not right living. What it is acting like a god. Okay, and that is the premise or the thought process that's passed down in the contemporary writings in Greek when this word is used. Okay, and generally speaking, we need to look at the fact that it's actually this word here, which is eu, which means to be well off or fair, right? And sebo, which is what? To be revered or worshipped, which means what? You are acting like a god. Now, getting back to our verse, seeing that his divine power has granted to us everything pertaining to life and godliness through the true knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and excellence. For by these he granted to us his precious, magnificent promises, so that by them you may become partakers of the divine nature. What is the divine nature? Benevolence, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. Now watch this now. Now for this very reason also, applying all diligence in your faith, supply moral excellence. And in your moral excellence, supply knowledge, right? I know it doesn't say supply there, but you get my point. And in your knowledge, self-control. And in your self-control, perseverance. And in your perseverance, godliness. And in your godliness, brotherly kindness, right? And let's see if that godliness is the same word. I believe it is. In your self-control, perseverance, godliness. Yeah, it is. It's eusebia. Okay, and so what is my point? My point is here is a list of attributes that pertain to the emanations of the intensification of all power in the universe. And it's saying to add to them. Well, how do you add to an attribute of God that exists? By actually actioning it. And so on the first day, and I can tell you, I learned this from an interesting source. So originally there was this group that were believers with Herbert Armstrong. I believe his name is Herbert Armstrong. And it was labeled by Christianity Armstrongism, which we won't get into that, but they were definitely observant of Torah, and they kept they kept the feasts, etc. In fact, they had one of the biggest Feast of Tabernacles of any group of their time. And eventually there was a big breakup. I can't remember how all it works out, but I can tell you that there was a very specific individual who was involved with Armstrong, and he actually put out a pamphlet explaining how to keep the Omer, and it consequently is the Kabbalistic method of viewing the light of the divine attributes and then using them as a guide on how to behave that day, but they don't understand the depth of the ramifications. So it was interesting. It was my first introduction into it. And as I began to study it and understand it, I was actually blown away by what they didn't understand about it, but were still trying to do. They were trying to do just that, to see themselves in that light, right? But not how you would think. They would say, okay, so we are going to do mercy within mercy, and so therefore I'm going to be extremely merciful this day. But what they don't realize is that that is the only light that is actually being broadcast from Passover you are moving with the wave, and if you're moving with the wave and a wave intersects with something, then if that something absorbs that wave, then it is receiving it, right? This is how you go to your radio. You tune into your radio, the little antenna on top of your car somewhere. You tune into your radio and you start getting the rock and roll song. That's because it was broadcast from somewhere. And as you were moving, you intercepted that wave. So the premise is we're moving along and we are moving with the wave. We are moving with the peak of the wave or the magnitude of the wave. And in general, what's occurring is as we're moving along, we are demonstrating the receiving and then what? The broadcasting again of it. So what we are is a repeater or a reflection, a mirror. And so how do you mirror the intensification of all power in the universe? Well, if it's an attribute of mercy upon mercy, then obviously you have to activate mercy. Now, I'm going to get into something very important here in a moment. And if it's mercy upon mercy, then at that moment in time, that is the only light of Passover that's being activated within the world at that time through the beacons of light, right? We don't have a visible light here. I'm not talking about photon emission through resistance. I am talking about the light you can't see, the waves you can't see. The Hertzian energy is just a symptom or proof of the potential energies. You see, when we talk about the full measurement of energy, and we say kinetic plus potential, you can't see potential. You can't know it. It affects time, it affects space, it affects gravity, but we can't know it. And I'm not going to get into it too much today, but I'm going to say that you are actually moving with that wave of light. Then it is reflecting off of you as you're moving with it. We're moving forward through the wilderness, right? Accepting that we're hungry because we know that food is coming, accepting that we're thirsty because we know that it's going to be quenched, accepting the fears that we experience because we know we're going to be protected, we know we're going to be victorious in the battle because that is exactly why that's why the pillar of fire is there, to tell me that I have a certain identity. And as that light comes down and hits me as heat and light, and I experience it, then I identify that I am a very different human being than what people think that I am. But I'm going to do one better, because what people think I am is the wounds. What I think I am as some of my own light, right? But then also there is the belief that I can't because of how I view myself in my own light. So whether I'm worried about what other people are thinking about me and what other people say that I am not in the light of Passover, and therefore I am a twisted mind. I am evil. But if I don't accept that information and say, wait a minute, even my epigenetics says I am the intensification of all power in the universe dumping down into a meat sack, well, I can tell you then there's a very different thing, isn't there? You know, I will tell you, when I began this journey, I had this intense connection and relationship with the intensification of all power in the universe, whom at that time I called Lord God, and whom I called Jesus Christ. And I can tell you at that time, I would experience moments when I would write my own psalms because I was that in love. And I would write my own proverbs. And people would get so offended. They say, you can't write psalms. You can't write proverbs. You're supposed to read those. But that's how I felt. That's how close I felt. And when I began to experience and learn the deeper things that where it was like, okay, I want more of your spirit. I want more of your knowledge. I want more of understanding you. And all of a sudden, he ended up here instead of out there. He was out here with me. And I was like, oh yes, I love you. I love that. But when he got here, it was like, oh wait, that's a really bad place. That's a really bad thing. Not understanding that when it says the kingdom of heaven is within you, that the throne is actually on the throne of your heart. You can understand that the better part of you, the best part of you, the part of you that's obedient to God, the part of you that understands the ramifications of the kinsman redeemer in the third cup of Passover, the part of you that realizes he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God, and we are the righteousness of God. I'm going to tell you right now, the righteousness of God is the righteousness of God. Not some dichotomous thing out here, but you are the righteousness of God. Do you understand that? That the magnitude of the dunamis within you, the power within you, not authority, that's a different story. That's exousia, right? When Yeshua says all power has been given me in heaven and on earth, therefore go ye forth. In other words, here I'm sending you as agents. In fact, the word evangelist comes from euangelis, which is what? A messenger or agent of who? Jesus Christ. That's what it says. A messenger of Jesus Christ. Okay? An apostle, right? Of Jesus Christ. And so the premise is that there is this concept of agency given in their authority. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about dunamis. I'm talking about the energy that you guys are terrified of when you start hearing things about movements of energy and about sacred geometry and about crystals and about all the other things that you reject because you think it's not in the Bible. But if you would take 2 seconds to go see it, go see that they smudge with cedar and hyssop is actually a species of sage. Go see where they have crystals on a breastplate. That is not something to represent the tribes of Israel. That had power. That had dunamis. And that dunamis is the light of Passover that will only be executed through you who what? Accepts the identity because of the pillar of cloud. There have been plenty of questions about whether or not God loves you when you were going through the season of deliverance in Egypt because of the plagues that fell upon you. But when you arrive at the other side of the Red Sea and you have the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, and now all of a sudden you are looking into that thing and you are actually feeling that light reflect off of you. The man standing in front of you, if the pillar of light is here behind him, sees the reflection of the pillar of light coming off of you, then now you understand the context of the pillar of light. You are the reflector. You are the mirror. So how do you do this? You go into day 1 of the counting of Omer and you say, today is the energy, dunamis, the energy that went out of Yeshua when the woman touched, everybody was touching him, but there was only one who was in a state of reception. Dunamis went out of Yeshua. That energy is the energy that does the things that we are talking about. That the righteous requirements of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. For why? Because the flesh cannot be subject to the law of God, nor indeed is it. What actually keeps the Torah in you? The Father. What actually activates the Torah within you? The light of the Messiah. The next time that we talk, we'll talk about the balance. We'll talk about how these attributes pull against each other. And so when you're in the counting of the Omer, what you need in order to pull. And I'm going to tell you, I'll probably have plenty more besides that because I have to have a confirmed message before I will speak. But I do know that this is like the cycles teaching. There's more information to be had here. So as you begin the Omer, which consequently, let's just take a look at that really quick. I can tell you that I neither endorse nor do I oppose Michael Root. In other words, I just kind of leave him for his own existence and let Yahweh work through him and do his thing. But we are in what we call the month of Aviv. And what's important to know is that we began Passover on the 13th of April. I don't want to make a phone call. We began Passover on the 13th of April. Okay, and it started at sundown on the 12th. Okay, so now we're coming into tonight, right? Tonight on April 20th at sundown begins what? The day of first fruits. Tonight at sundown begins the day of first fruits, and look here, the first day of the counting of Omer starts tonight. Now, stop trying to call. And generally speaking, the context here is that you will begin counting as the day begins and the sun begins to rise upon and give light to the day, right? But the day actually begins in darkness. The day begins at sundown and specifically at twilight. So you could potentially meditate upon the mercy upon mercy, right, at twilight. Because Havdalah, which is the ending of Shabbat, has to have 3 stars in the sky. We accept that Shabbat has ended when there's 3 stars in the sky. That's an ancient tradition to identify that Shabbat is complete and you may resume your business dealings. Okay? You may go out and anoint your dead, like Mary did. Which means what? She didn't go out in the morning, did she? No, she did not go out in the morning. I'm not going to get into that today because I don't feel like bashing on Easter. I like that Christians celebrate the resurrection. I just wish they would celebrate the death a little better. So the premise is that tonight, as the sun sets and there's 3 stars in the sky, because it's the Shabbat, you can begin counting this Omer that I'm talking about. Now, for those of you who don't know where to look for something to meditate upon, at least go and look in Isaiah 11, okay? Isaiah 11 talks about the spirits of God. And I'm going to propose to you that that could be a very good meditation for the Omer. Now, I use a Kabbalistic one because of that introduction from Mr. Denkenbring, who was an associate of Armstrong's. And I just experienced experiential knowledge overrides spiritual and written. I experienced a witness from all of the things around me that was a very effective way for me to meditate upon the Omer. So no, not the Song of Songs. So generally speaking, if we go into Isaiah chapter 11, we will look at verse 2. The Spirit of Yahweh will rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, and the Spirit of counsel and of strength, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of Yahweh. Now, what you could do under the right circumstances, and you can pick any number of these lists of attributes. Listen, you could go in and look at the one when Yahweh walks past Moses and declares himself, right? Yahweh, Raham, etc., etc. This is not bound to a meditation of the Kabbalistic Sifrot, but can be, right? It's your choice. What you're not going to do is try to make something out of nothing. How many spirits do we have here? The Spirit of the Lord, right? Will rest upon the Spirit of wisdom, the Spirit of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and strength, the Spirit of knowledge and fear, 7. Just like the 7 that we need to count. We need to count 7 sevens, which means what? We would count the Spirit of Yahweh within the Spirit of Yahweh, which would be the intensification of all power in the universe. The Spirit of wisdom within the Spirit of Yahweh. You would connect those. And I may talk about those more as time progresses on, or I may send something to Slack for those of you who are in the congregation. Point being is you meditate upon the light that you see and you try to copy it. You try to emulate it. Okay? Which is going to require you to tap into dunamis. It's going to require you to tap into that stuff that went out of Yeshua. And it's going to require you to actually exude it in the energy that it is that day. So if it's the energy of the Spirit of wisdom, then you will exude wisdom. Now, watch this. You find the list that you want to use to meditate upon and activate. What happens when you make the decision to activate mercy upon mercy? Let me take you back to the beginning. There are 2 attributes behind mercy. 1, guilt. 2, not a full extent of the law. A reduction in the a reduction in the sentencing. Which means what? A person would have to be guilty to you, and that person would have to receive a lesser sentence because of your kindness of your heart. Which means what? Something has to come and become guilty to you. You see how this works? You want to manifest, you want to be like God, you want to demonstrate the light to this world, then you need to realize that the deficit has to occur for the light to flow into, which is the whole point behind it in the first place. Why are we broadcasting the light of Passover? Because people still need it. But the people who need it are going to be twisted minds. I've taught you this before. That when you start to activate the light, there needs to be something for the light to flow into. And I can tell you, if you are wanting to activate the light of patience, then guess what? Then you are going to have to give that to something that's impatient. You will create the balance. We'll talk about that more. But the premise is that if we have, say, for example, the spirit of knowledge, what does that mean? That means you're probably going to teach somebody that day. So you better know how to teach. You better know how to say the things. Now, I can tell you, you could do it the way that I do it, which is that I don't prepare anything and I just speak. And I just trust that Yahweh is going to speak what needs to be spoken through me. So in a weird sort of way, all I'm doing is the light's coming in and then reflecting off of me. That's it. Okay? And so the premise is that you start to get your idea that basically now you will have a measurement. What is the measurement? Well, I've taught you before. When you are doing archery, okay, and I've done this as an object lesson, I've taught it to people as an object lesson, when they are actually shooting the bow, they will shoot, and there are people who will look at that target and they will say, oh, you know what, I missed, right? Which is seen. You are without the bullseye. But then there are other people that say, okay, I need to make an adjustment 6 inches to the left and up about 2 and fire again. Why? Because they believe that that's how far they are, that they have accomplished. They believe that that's how far they've gotten to the center. Instead of thinking how far they missed from the center, they think about how far they've gotten to it. In fact, the word sin itself, chata, has to do with a twisted rope that has knots in it, right? And those knots actually are the length of how far you have come from the target. But people think that sin is about how you have failed. When you're firing the arrows at the bolt at the target, if you hit the target, that's an accomplishment. If you miss the target, but it just missed it and went off into the field behind you, you just missed the target. Not you have failed, right? And so the premise is that the way that you need to be looking at yourself during this Passover season while you're hungry, while you're thirsty, and while you're afraid is not God is doing this to me, that God brought me out into the wilderness to die, that God is the one who's allowing the Amalekites to attack me, but instead to say, deliverance is coming. The manna is coming. The water is coming. And in that process, what? Demonstrate that you are actually a emanation of the intensification of all power in the universe. And as we get deeper into this, you're going to see how powerful this really actually is. Some of the download that I've experienced today concerning this has just been insane. But I want you to find something like Isaiah where you can meditate upon it, right? You could do the attributes that Peter mentioned where you add to. But the idea is that you are contributing your light to that energy. So here's the interesting thing about it. If it's true that light is being reflected off of you and you are a beacon or a repeater, right? Like in radio, where you have an antenna at the top of the mountain and somebody broadcasts from this side of the mountain, and there's somebody on the other side of the mountain who now gets that signal because that antenna will catch that signal, amplify it, and send it down to the other town. We actually have a mountain separating the radio waves. That repeater is actually what is giving the people on that side the broadcast. You are a repeater. You are sticking with the wave and you are broadcasting the wave as you intercept it. So that requires you to move forward and not be stagnant. That's a given, right? We're not going to sit there and be the dead waters that required the tree, right, to make them sweet again, that bitterness that it was there. But what I want you to really kind of adjust your brain to is instead of looking at the attributes of darkness that you need to repent from at Yom Kippur, you're going to practice being God. You're going to practice being Yahweh. And the way that you're going to do that is you're going to actually action those attributes. Is it perfect? No, it's not going to be perfect. Are you kidding me? I don't think I've ever made it through an entire Omer and forgot to count a day. Or I've made it through an entire Omer and did the thing that I wanted to do that day. The say mercy within judgment, which is where you allow there to be justice, but you apply mercy to it. Failed miserably, right? And what's interesting is that the vessels that will present themselves during this time are actually the vessels who believe that God brought them out into the wilderness to die. You can enlighten them and say, no, the manna is coming. Let me prove it to you. Here's the light. And they see the pillar of light reflected off of you. You see? So, this is not an easy season, okay? But your response to it is designed to create an influence upon others who believe that it's not an easy season and that there is no other answer. Joshua and Caleb were the only ones that the pillar of light reflected off of. And the people couldn't stand it. They wanted to stone them at the promised land border, right? And Yahweh had to flash out from the tabernacle and be like, you guys are out of order, right? So, congratulations on making it to Passover. Congratulations. I hope you really enjoyed Passover. And I hope that you took the third cup very seriously, the cup of remembrance of Yeshua. But I can tell you, we are on the other side of it now. And so we are in that part when you're looking at the light bulb and you can't see the other side, and you just assume that it's round and that it's got light on the other side. And if you turn to the other side, you see that proof, but you're still not seeing the other side, right? Because when you turn, you're still not seeing the other side, right? And so guess what? We're on the other side. This is the concealment that is after Passover, the concealment that comes in the form of hunger, thirst, and fear. But your response to it will demonstrate the elevation of the world. Do you know that this time, accounting of Omer, is actually the greatest moment in time of Tikkun Olam, the repair of the worlds? That's right, I said plural, worlds. Because there are things you don't understand about the ripples. So now you beacon that light out, and what happens with that ripple? It goes out in the magnitude that you sent it out, regardless of how calm it feels once your ripple has gone out a little bit. It's about acceptance. It's about accepting the truth about who you are. It's about accepting that there are limiting beliefs, there are entitlements, and there are wounds that are all lies about you that you use your imagination to augment. There's more on that when we do Renewing Your Mind series, which consequently is coming back up soon. But I can tell you, this is what elevates Pentecost to the place that it did when they had the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Because they had elevated through the counting of the Omer. 40 days into the counting of Omer, we're sitting there, and all of a sudden Yeshua's like, oh, gotta go. Boom! And he elevates so high that we're done with it. He's no longer manifest as physical. He has gone into a realm that does not have material mass. But I can tell you that energy that he is now was present from the beginning until the end. And that energy that he is now, as a result of that ascension, is the energy that he's going to what? Bring into this world through whom? Us. Which would beg the question, how fast did he actually come back? I would say there's a potential that he came back when Peter said, silver and gold have I none, but what I have give I thee. Just saying. Now, maybe some people might have a problem with that. I'm sure Darby's rolling over in his grave right now. But generally speaking, there is the potential that this energy that I'm talking about, which is clearly from Yahweh, which is clearly manifest through Yeshua, which is clearly seems to have its transference and its process through touch. I mean, there's more on that, I'm sure. That stuff is what you actually need to be actioning. The dunamis. Okay, so having said all that, I'll say that there's a lot that goes into this season, and obviously this is a privilege to be in it. The feast day season is amazing. Reaping what we've sown, yes, amen. That can get difficult, but our response to it is so elevated. The revelation that you're going to have during this time, if you respond to it correctly, is insane. Some of the stuff that I've learned from my father since my beginning to step into these cycles correctly has been insane. And now we're beginning to understand more about who Yeshua was and what his example was. So be strong, be encouraged. Don't think that God brought you out into the wilderness to die. That's not it. This is a reciprocation on your behavior in the past. And you need to accept that and ask for mercy. Because there's going to come a time on the other side of this thing of what you sowed good, where you're going to experience the prosperity and you're going to go, oh yeah, that's great. I love what I'm experiencing right now. But what you need to understand is the only way in which to properly operate within this is to operate within the fact that you cannot add to nor take away from the title of the righteousness of God. which is the light of Passover, which is the light of the Messiah, which is the dunamis, which is the light that you are supposed to be, that Yeshua said that you are. Okay? All right. Shabbat shalom.